The night patrol had always been my quiet hour, the stretch of time when the radio stayed mostly silent and the desert felt honest. No witnesses, no paperwork, just the road unspooling ahead of my headlights and the low hum of the engine vibrating up through the steering wheel. Out here, 30 miles from town, the darkness didn't rush at you. It waited. It settled in layers, like dust. The wind moved across the plain in uneven breaths, pushing against the truck hard enough to rock it slightly, then pulling away as if reconsidering. When I stepped out to stretch my legs, the smell hit first. Dry stone, old earth, something faintly metallic, like rust warmed by the day's sun and only now allowed to cool. My boots crunched softly on gravel, each step sounding louder than it should have in the open air. I remember thinking how easy it would be to disappear here. No trees to hide you, no shadows deep enough to swallow a body, yet the vastness itself did the job. You could stand in plain sight and still feel erased. The sky pressed down, heavy with stars, and for a moment I felt the uncomfortable sensation of being measured, as if the land were taking note of my shape, my weight, my presence. I told myself it was fatigue. 27 years on the job trained you to name things before they grew teeth. Still, when I leaned back against the truck and looked toward the distant hills, I felt it again, that subtle shift, like attention turning in my direction. Not movement, not sound, just the certainty that the night had noticed me and had decided not to look away. I first noticed the lights the way you notice a thought you didn't mean to have, already there before you can trace where it came from. They hovered far out past the hills, low to the ground, dim enough that I might have dismissed them as reflections if they hadn't held their position against the wind. 3 of them at first, then 4. They didn't flicker like aircraft or pulse like flares. They breathed. I rested my forearms on the hood of the truck and watched. Distance did strange things out here. Objects shrank without truly becoming smaller, as if perspective itself was unreliable. The lights felt farther than they should have been, yet uncomfortably clear, their edges too precise for something born of dust or heat. Every few seconds, one would drift slightly, correcting itself, as though maintaining a formation only it understood. The radio crackled behind me, a single burst of static that died before forming words. I reached to turn the volume down, then stopped. The sound hadn't come from the speaker, it had come from the air. A faint vibration settled into my chest, low and rhythmic, sinking itself to my breathing before I could resist it. I told myself the stories: atmospheric refraction, thermal inversion, swamp gas, if you wanted to be lazy about it. I'd repeated those explanations before, for tourists and deputies alike. But standing there alone, watching those distant points of light adjust their spacing, as if reacting to my gaze, I felt the hollow certainty that these weren't simply appearing. They were holding position, and they were waiting. By the time I drove back into town, the lights were already a rumor again, something that existed only if you stood in the right place and asked the wrong questions. Marfa had learned that trick decades ago. We lived off postcards and late-night curiosity, off people who wanted a mystery they could photograph and then leave behind. The town gave them just enough to talk about, never enough to stay. At the diner on Highland Avenue, the night shift moved with practiced indifference. Coffee poured, plates slid across the counter. No one asked why I'd been out so late, or why dust still clung to my boots. When the topic of the lights came up, as it always did with visitors, it was handled gently, like a nervous habit. Smiles, shrugs, a rehearsed list of explanations that closed the conversation before it could wander. I understood the unspoken agreement. Curiosity was acceptable. Attention was not. You could look, but only briefly. You could wonder, but never long enough for it to wonder back. The older locals had perfected this balance. They spoke of strange nights the way you speak of bad weather, unpleasant, unavoidable, and not worth studying too closely. Even the records reflected it. Missing persons filed under misadventure, reports trimmed of anything that sounded uncertain, photographs labeled artifact and locked away. We didn't erase the truth. We buried it under normalcy, under repetition, under the comforting weight of routine. That night, as I locked the station and listened to the building settle, I realized something Marfa never said out loud. The town didn't doubt the lights. It trusted them just enough to know better than to stare. They found her just after dawn, when the desert was still undecided about becoming day. The call came in clipped and careful, the way dispatch sounds when it doesn't want to shape panic into words. I arrived before the sun had fully cleared the hills, the light thin and colorless, making everything look unfinished. She lay on her back, arms at her sides, as if placed rather than dropped. No sign of struggle, no dragged earth. What stopped everyone from stepping closer were the stones. 13 of them, spaced evenly around her body, each one the size of a fist, each painted with symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters, not marks. They looked intentional in a way that made my skin tighten, as if the ground itself had been measured. I crouched near her chest and understood what the others were avoiding. The incision was precise, too precise. Clean edges, no tearing, no hesitation. Her heart was gone, but there was no frenzy in the work, only patience, reverence, even. Whoever did this had taken time, had known exactly how long a human body could remain open before becoming something else. The air felt wrong inside the circle. Sound dulled, like cotton pressed against the ears. I noticed flies gathering at the perimeter, but refusing to cross. One deputy whispered a prayer without realizing he was doing it. I marked the stones in my notebook, counting twice to be sure. 13. The number settled into my thoughts and stayed there, heavy and deliberate, like a door that had been closed carefully instead of slammed. The autopsy report arrived 2 days later, thinner than it should have been, as if words themselves were reluctant to stay on the page. Cause of death was listed plainly enough, but every line after that felt evasive. The medical examiner circled the same conclusion twice. The heart had not been torn out. It had been removed. The incision followed a path you'd expect from someone trained. Someone who understood anatomy not as theory, but as memory. No damage to surrounding tissue. No wasted motion. It reminded me of surgical diagrams I'd seen years ago in evidence photos. Hands that trusted themselves completely. What unsettled me most was what wasn't there. No defensive wounds. No chemical residue. No sign the victim had been restrained or sedated. She shouldn't have stayed conscious, the examiner said quietly, more to himself than to me. But there's no proof she didn't. I kept staring at the empty space where the heart had been, trying to reconcile the absence. It felt deliberate in a way violence rarely is, like something had been retrieved, not stolen, taken because it was needed elsewhere. Later, alone in my office, I realized something I hadn't written down. There was no blood pooling beneath the body in the scene photos. Not enough. Anyway, as if the body had been prepared to give, not forced. That absence stayed with me longer than any mark ever could. Quiet, clean, and impossibly intentional. The photographs came last, slid across my desk in a plain envelope with no comment attached. Crime scene stills, routine angles, nothing out of order at first glance. I flipped through them slowly, letting my eyes adjust, training myself to see what I was supposed to see. The body, The stones. The ground disturbed only where boots had already ruined it. It was the third photo that made me stop. A wide shot, taken from slightly uphill. The circle intact. At the center, near the woman's head. There was a shape I couldn't place. Not solid, not shadow. It didn't interrupt the light so much as bend it, like heat rising off asphalt. Except the morning had been cold. I checked the timestamp. Same moment as the others. I checked the next frame. The shape was gone. I called the photographer in. He stood where I pointed, frowning, then shook his head. He didn't remember seeing anything there. No movement, no anomaly, just the body and the stones. I watched his eyes skim past the spot without slowing. The way people overlook a word they've already decided doesn't belong. I enlarged the image until the pixels broke apart. The shape refused definition. It wasn't familiar enough to name, not strange enough to accuse. It felt unfinished, like a thought interrupted before it could decide what it was. I filed the photo under Artifact and locked it away. But that night, when I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Not clearer, not closer, just present, waiting for meaning I couldn't give it. The second body was found 40 miles south, far enough to quiet the word coincidence, but close enough to keep denial breathing. Same hour of the morning, same undecided light. The desert hadn't learned anything overnight. Neither had we. He lay near an old service road that hadn't seen use in years. Boots aligned with the ruts as if he'd been guided there. The circle was tighter this time. 13 stones again. Identical spacing. The same unfamiliar symbols, though one had been repainted. The color still tacky, catching grit in the wind. I didn't have to count. My eyes went to the gaps first, measuring what should be there. It was. The incision matched the first. Angle, depth, restraint. Even the absence felt consistent, as though whoever did this was following a template rather than improvising. I felt a small, cold relief at that. Patterns meant predictability. Predictability meant control. Or so I told myself. When I pulled the map from the truck and marked the location, a line formed between the 2 points without my help. Not straight. Purposeful. The kind of alignment you notice only after it's already there, waiting for you to acknowledge it. A deputy asked if we were dealing with a copycat. I watched the wind drag a thin veil of dust across the stones, careful not to disturb them, and shook my head. Copycats mimic results. This was replication of intent, and intent. I was learning, had a direction. By the time the second body was logged, and the third location pinned to the map, the pattern stopped pretending to be coincidence. I spread the photographs across my desk after midnight, pushing aside coffee rings and old reports, letting the town recede into the background hum of the station. From above, stripped of names and faces, the sights spoke more clearly than any witness ever could. Lines began to form. Not straight at first, nothing so obvious, but curves that suggested intention. When I connected the points with a pencil, my hand hesitated, then continued on its own. The shape that emerged wasn't a symbol I recognized. It wasn't religious, or cultural, or mathematical in any way I'd been trained to identify. It was quieter than that. Balanced, deliberate, like something designed to be felt rather than understood. What unsettled me was how naturally the silence settled over those places. Reports from deputies mentioned the same thing without using the same words. Radios losing clarity. Footsteps sounding distant, even when close. At each site, sound behaved differently, as if the air had learned to hold its breath. Birds avoided the areas. Wind thinned out, then turned all at once when you stepped away. I overlaid an old tourist map on top of my sketch and felt a slow chill crawl up my spine. The center wasn't a building or a road. It was empty land, open desert, the viewing station. I erased the lines, then redrew them. The geometry didn't change. Whatever this was, it wasn't marking locations of death. It was outlining a boundary and standing there alone in the quiet station. I understood something I hadn't wanted to name yet. Silence wasn't a byproduct of the pattern. It was the point. By the end of the week, the case had developed a weight that paperwork couldn't carry. Every report I filed felt provisional, like a draft written in pencil while someone stood behind me, ready to erase certain lines. Evidence existed, but it refused to settle into motive or method. Each answer widened the gap instead of narrowing it. The victims had no shared history, no financial links, no digital trail, no overlapping routines. They lived different lives, moved through different circles. Yet the manner of their deaths aligned with a precision that mocked coincidence. When I asked for behavioral profiles, the consultants gave me theories that collapsed under their own certainty. Ritual killer, copycat, delusion. None of it explained the restraint, the patience, the absence of panic at the scenes. What troubled me most were the timestamps. Arrival estimates disagreed depending on who wrote them. Security cameras near one site showed empty frames where motion should have been recorded. In another, a shadow appeared on the footage, tall, blurred, out of proportion, then vanished before the software could flag it. No one else seemed eager to pursue that detail. I found myself rereading old cold cases late at night, ones that had ended quietly without arrests or answers. Missing hikers, abandoned vehicles, reports stamped closed despite lacking conclusions. I began to see familiar gaps, the same polite omissions, the same exhaustion masquerading as resolution. The case wasn't unsolved. It was resisting being finished. And the more I tried to force it into an ending, the clearer it became that something had already decided how much of the truth I was allowed to keep. I met Maria Crow Feather in the late afternoon, when the heat had dulled into something tolerable and the shadows finally began to stretch. She was waiting outside the station without asking to be let in, as if she already knew the shape of the conversation and didn't need a room for it. Her eyes stayed on the horizon while she spoke. Not on me. Not on the badge. "You're looking at the lights the wrong way," she said. Before I'd even offered my name, her voice was calm, practiced, like someone reciting a warning that had survived being ignored too many times. She told me her family had lived near this land long before roads or viewing platforms gave it names. What we called a mystery, they called a habit. She didn't describe the lights as spirits or omens. She called them openings. Windows that never fully closed. Things on the other side didn't cross because they couldn't, only because they were watching. Waiting for patterns to repeat, for attention to gather in the right places. I asked her why she was telling me this now. She finally turned toward me then, and I noticed how tired her face was, as if she'd been measuring time in losses instead of years. "Because people have started feeding them again," she said, "and because you're standing too close to the glass." When she left, the air felt thinner, like a pressure change before a storm. I wrote her name in my notebook and underlined it twice, already aware that whatever she had given me wasn't information. It was a responsibility I hadn't agreed to carry. I tried, for a while, to translate what Maria had said into something safer. Phenomena were manageable. They could be categorized, photographed, explained away with enough data and the right tone of voice. Windows were different. Windows implied intent on both sides. Someone looking out, and something else looking in. That night, I returned to the viewing station alone. The platform was empty, the tourist placards humming softly in the wind. I stood where the fence ended and the desert began, staring into the distance until my eyes ached. When the lights appeared, they did so without ceremony. No sudden flare, no dramatic entrance. They were simply there, occupying space as if they had always belonged to it. I realized then that they didn't illuminate anything. They cast no real light on the ground, no shadows that could be measured. They existed without revealing, glowing in a way that felt informational rather than physical, like indicators or pupils. The longer I watched, the more aware I became of my own body, my breathing, my pulse, the small involuntary adjustments I made to stay balanced. It felt important, suddenly, that I was conscious of myself, as if awareness itself had weight. I understood why calling them phenomena had always felt incomplete. Phenomena happened to you. This felt reciprocal. The lights did not demand attention. They rewarded it. And standing there in the quiet, I sensed the danger wasn't that something might come through those windows. It was that something already had, and was waiting for us to notice. The stories Maria shared never described violence the way we understand it. There were no claws, no fangs, no sudden rush of blood or screaming victims dragged into the dark. What she spoke of was quieter, and somehow worse. A hunger that didn't chase, a hunger that waited for something to be offered. She explained it carefully, choosing words the way you choose stones to cross deep water. The Watchers, she said, did not consume bodies the way animals do. They fed on transitions, on the moment something changed from one state to another, breath leaving lungs, awareness slipping into sleep, life thinning into memory. Death was only useful because it was loud. I thought of the crime scenes, the calm placement, the lack of struggle, the sense that something had been given, not taken. The missing heart stopped feeling symbolic and began to feel practical, like keys removed from locks that no longer mattered. Teeth would have been crude. Teeth implied urgency. These things had none. What unsettled me most was her certainty that they were not cruel. Cruelty required intent to harm. This was appetite without malice, consumption without judgment. To the Watchers, we weren't enemies or victims. We were conditions, environments, a surface to press against until it thinned. Driving home that night, I kept replaying one sentence she'd said almost casually. They don't break in. The desert rolled past my headlights, endless and patient. They wait for permission. I'd known Morrison for years before his name ever landed in my notebook. In a town this size, doctors became fixtures, faces you trusted without examining too closely. He'd stitched up ranch hands, delivered babies, signed death certificates with the same steady hand. When people spoke about him, it was always with gratitude or pity. The accident had taken his wife and daughter in a single winter night, and afterward, he'd learned how to move through grief without making noise. What changed, according to those who noticed, wasn't his kindness but his listening. Patients said he asked questions that lingered too long after answers were given. He wanted to know what people saw just before they lost consciousness, what they heard in the space between pain and relief. Near death wasn't an emergency to him. It was a threshold, something to be studied. The first time I interviewed him, his office smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust, like a place that had stopped expecting new things to arrive. He answered everything politely, almost eagerly, but his attention drifted when I spoke, sliding past me toward something internal. I had the unsettling sense that I was interrupting a conversation already in progress. Later, reviewing traffic footage near the viewing station, I spotted his truck parked there on a night he hadn't been on call when I asked him about it. He smiled, not defensively, but with recognition, as if I'd finally caught up. Some people hear strange things once and turn away. Morrison had heard them, and instead of covering his ears, he'd leaned in, and whatever answered him back hadn't needed to raise its voice. The people who gathered around Morrison never called themselves followers. They preferred quieter words: support group, discussion circle, seekers. Most of them had lost someone, a child to an accident on the highway, a husband to a sudden illness, a mother who went to sleep and didn't wake up. Grief was the only membership requirement, and it was something everyone paid in advance. They met in borrowed spaces, living rooms, back rooms of closed shops, the chapel after evening mass, when Father Miguel locked the doors and stayed behind. There were no chants, no symbols at first, just stories. Morrison listened while they spoke about final phone calls, unfinished arguments, the unbearable certainty that something important had been interrupted mid-sentence. He never contradicted them. He never offered comfort in the usual way. Instead, he spoke about proximity, about moments when the world felt thin, when loss sharpened perception instead of dulling it. He suggested that death wasn't an ending, but a narrowing, a place where attention could still pass through if focused carefully enough. That what we missed wasn't gone. It was just standing on the other side of a surface we didn't know how to touch. What frightened me later wasn't the belief itself, but how gentle it was. No one was promised power. No one was told they were chosen. They were told only that longing had weight, that love didn't dissipate, it accumulated, and if enough of it gathered in one place, something might notice. Faith built from fear collapses quickly. Faith built from loss endures. By the time I understood that, Morrison no longer needed to persuade anyone. They were already leaning toward the glass, listening for something they were certain was listening back. Once I started looking beyond Morrison, the circle revealed itself with unsettling ease. Names surfaced not through confession, but through patterns, overlapping meetings, shared absences, the same vehicles appearing near places they didn't belong. These weren't outsiders or drifters. They were people whose signatures already filled town records, people who approved permits, blessed congregations, controlled land. The mayor's office returned calls too quickly, her questions sharpened by knowledge she shouldn't have had yet. A rancher I'd known since my first year on the force suddenly took an interest in zoning maps around the viewing station. Father Miguel stopped offering prayers for the dead by name, switching instead to vague invocations about guidance and reunion. None of it was overt. It didn't need to be. What bound them wasn't secrecy, it was confidence, the quiet assurance that they were aligned with something inevitable. When I pressed, doors didn't slam. They softened. Conversations drifted. Appointments were postponed with polite smiles. I began to understand that resistance wasn't necessary when belief did the work for you. At night, I marked their names on the map, watching how they formed a ring around Morrison without ever touching him. Protectors, witnesses, anchors. The shape mirrored the stones too closely to ignore. Authority hadn't been corrupted. It had been repurposed. The circle didn't feel like a conspiracy closing in. It felt like a hand tightening slowly, patiently, confident that nothing inside it needed to struggle anymore. The first reports treated it like clerical error. A witness listed as 53 appeared 40 in the follow-up interview, his face smoother, his hands steadier. Another woman, barely 30 on paper, moved with the stiffness of someone twice that age, joints clicking softly when she sat. Birth dates didn't change. Records stayed consistent. Only the people drifted out of alignment with them. I told myself stress did strange things to perception. Trauma distorted memory, but the discrepancies kept repeating, always near the same locations, always after sunset. Deputies compared notes in low voices, uneasy but careful not to phrase their concerns too clearly. Nobody wanted to be the first to say time itself was slipping its leash. Clocks became unreliable companions. Digital watches lost minutes overnight, then caught up hours later without explanation. The station wall clock ran slow only during night shifts, as if reluctant to move forward when the lights were visible from the parking lot. My own wristwatch stopped twice while I was at a scene, restarting the moment I stepped beyond the perimeter. The worst moment came during an interview I'd already conducted. The man answered my questions politely, almost verbatim, but his tone was wrong, too familiar. When I checked my notes afterward, I realized I was reading statements dated 3 days in the future. Same handwriting, same phrasing. My signature already there. Time wasn't breaking. It was bending, settling unevenly around certain places, certain people. And once you noticed that misbehavior, it became impossible to pretend the case was still moving forward in any normal direction at all. The recording started as background noise, the kind you only notice when you've been listening too long. Static creeping in where a clean signal should have been. A soft hiss under voices already fading from memory. Dispatch logged it as interference. Old equipment, weather, nothing worth escalating. I didn't hear it properly until I played one tape alone. Late, the station lights dimmed to their overnight setting. A deputy's voice described a routine patrol, then paused mid-sentence. In the gap, something else surfaced. Not loud, not distorted. Calm, almost intimate. It spoke a name I recognized. The victims, pronounced with familiarity that made my stomach tighten. I rewound the tape. The deputy's report was intact. No pause, no second voice. I checked the timestamp. The sound I'd heard hadn't existed on the waveform. It had lived somewhere between the words, carried by the expectation of sound rather than sound itself. After that, it became harder to ignore. Radios crackled on unused frequencies. Old channels we'd retired years ago lit up briefly, just long enough to transmit breath. Murmurs, fragments of sentences that never completed themselves. One night, my own voice came through, asking a question I hadn't asked yet. The technicians found nothing wrong, no external signal, no traceable source. When I pressed my ear close to the speaker, the sound vanished, as if proximity spoiled it. Whatever was speaking didn't want to be examined. It wanted to be overheard. I noticed the change gradually. The way you notice a familiar road, narrowing only after you've driven it too many times. The lights didn't surge forward or brighten dramatically. They simply refused to stay where they had always been. Each night I checked the horizon. They occupied a position that felt fractionally nearer, their spacing tighter, their presence more assured. Distance stopped behaving like a fixed measure. What looked far remained clear. Edges sharp enough to strain the eyes. The desert between us felt compressed, as if space itself were folding inward, quietly accommodating something that wanted better access. I tested it once, driving toward the viewing station, then stopping abruptly. The lights didn't retreat. They adjusted, holding their relation to me rather than the land. Standing there, I became aware of how often I blinked, how long my gaze lingered before instinct demanded a break. Each time I looked away and back again, the light seemed more settled, like furniture rearranged while you weren't watching. I began to understand that movement wasn't the right word. Approach implied effort. This felt permitted. The air carried a low vibration now, subtle enough to be mistaken for wind, steady enough to register in the chest before the ears. It matched my pulse too easily. When I stepped back, it faded. When I leaned forward, it returned, welcoming rather than aggressive. The realization arrived without drama. The lights weren't crossing ground. They were reducing the distance required to be noticed. And somewhere in that narrowing space, I felt the quiet certainty that proximity wasn't being forced upon us. It was being earned. The next body never appeared. No dawn call, no taped perimeter, no circle of stones waiting in the dust. At first, the absence felt like relief, the kind that loosens your shoulders before you realize it isn't earned. Days passed, then nights. The lights continued their slow, patient adjustments, indifferent to our expectation of escalation. What changed instead were the people. Reports came in of residents waking miles from home with no memory of leaving. A woman was found standing barefoot at the edge of the viewing station, eyes open, lip moving without sound. She hadn't been harmed. She hadn't been afraid. She told us she'd been listening. I returned to the early notes, the first crime scenes, the careful removals, the reverence. Blood had never felt like the point. It had been a tool, a loud one, useful for beginning, but inefficient for what came next. Morrison had spoken once, almost casually, about thresholds becoming easier to cross once they were understood. I hadn't realized he meant outgrown. There were no new incisions, no missing hearts. Instead, EEG scans showed synchronized activity across unrelated patients. Sleep cycles aligned. Dreams repeated themselves across different minds. The same imagery surfacing with minor variations, like a signal struggling through interference. Awareness had replaced sacrifice. Standing in the station parking lot one night, watching people drift past the fence without realizing why they were there. I understood the shift with cold clarity. Blood demanded bodies. Consciousness was abundant, willing, already reaching. The ritual hadn't ended. It had refined itself, and whatever waited behind the lights no longer needed us broken open. It only needed us awake. I saw them only once, and even then, I'm not certain sight is the right word. It happened during a night patrol near the station, when the lights had settled into their closest formation yet. The air felt thicker, resistant, like wading into water without moving your feet. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, told myself to keep breathing evenly. Within the glow, something shifted. Filaments of light extended and retracted, impossibly thin, branching and reconnecting in patterns that refused depth or scale. They moved with purpose, but without urgency, testing the space around them, anchoring briefly before releasing. The closest comparison my mind could manage was spiders, but that was my fear supplying a metaphor, not an observation. They didn't crawl across the ground. They explored the light itself, nesting inside its brightness, threading through it the way nerves thread muscle, where one filament touched another. The glow intensified, pulsing softly, as if information were being exchanged. I felt it then, a faint pressure behind my eyes, a suggestion of thought that wasn't mine, brushing against the edges of awareness and moving on. I raised my radio without thinking. The moment I did, the shapes recoiled, not in alarm, but in adjustment, retreating deeper into the light. The signal screamed with feedback, a high, panicked whine that vanished the instant I lowered it again. Later, reviewing the footage from my dash cam, I saw nothing unusual, just light, just distance. But my hand shook as I turned the key, because I understood what those shapes were doing. They weren't invading our space. They were mapping attention. The first time it happened, I thought I'd blacked out. I was standing at the fence line, watching the lights hold their shape, when the sense of orientation slipped, not vanished, just loosened. My eyes were open, focused, yet the information I was receiving no longer felt routed through them. It was as if sight had become optional. I knew the arrangement of the lights without looking directly at them. I knew when one shifted, not by motion, but by absence. The way you know a familiar room has changed after the furniture's been moved in the dark. Closing my eyes didn't interrupt it. If anything, the awareness sharpened, freed from the distraction of form. With it came something else, the understanding that this perception wasn't mine alone. I could feel other points of attention nearby, overlapping, brushing against the same shapes from different angles. Not communication, alignment. Like multiple instruments tuning to the same frequency without exchanging notes. Fear arrived late, lagging behind comprehension. I realized then that eyes were inefficient, narrow gates built for a smaller world. Whatever observed us through the lights didn't need them. It sensed presence, intention, focus. When you noticed it, you completed the circuit. I forced myself to blink hard, to name objects aloud, to drag my awareness back into my body. The sensation receded reluctantly, like pressure easing from deep water. When my vision settled, the lights were unchanged, distant, contained. But I knew better now. Seeing had never been the risk. Attention was. And somewhere beyond the desert, something vast had learned that we could be perceived without ever being looked at. The calls came in scattered at first, easy to dismiss if you didn't line them up side by side. Neighbors describing the same landscape with different voices, a wide plain of dark stone. A low hum felt more than heard, light without source, hovering just beyond reach. None of them knew each other. None had spoken before sleeping. What unsettled me was the consistency. They described standing still while something moved closer. Not across space, but across awareness. As if the dream itself were being narrowed around them. Several mentioned counting without knowing why. 13 appeared often enough to stop feeling coincidental. When I asked what happened next, they all hesitated in the same way, pausing as if waiting for permission to continue. Sleepwalking followed. People found miles from home, shoes dusty, hands scraped raw from touching stone. They weren't panicked when we woke them. They were disoriented, embarrassed, convinced they'd been somewhere important and had left too early. One man asked me quietly if I'd seen the others. Certain I'd been there too. I stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. When I did drift off, I recognized the terrain immediately. The dream didn't unfold. It resumed. I felt the presence of others nearby, familiar in the way shared silence becomes familiar. No faces, no words, just alignment. When I woke, the sense of connection lingered, thin but persistent, like a thread pulled tight and left knotted inside my chest. The dreams weren't messages, they were rehearsals, and whatever was being prepared didn't need us afraid. It needed us synchronized. It became clear that the viewing station was no longer the center. People drifted there out of habit, out of memory. But the real convergence happened elsewhere, behind closed eyes. In the quiet hours when thought loosened its grip on structure. The lights no longer needed a place, they needed alignment. Doctors called it mass suggestion. Neurologists spoke about mirrored neurons and stress-induced synchronization. Their language circled the truth without touching it. What none of them could explain was intent. The way awareness seemed guided, gently narrowed, encouraged to lean in the same direction at the same time. I felt it myself during interviews. When I asked certain questions, answers came too quickly, as if already prepared. People finished my sentences without realizing it. Silence stretched, And in that stretch, something pressed back, not forcefully, but expectantly, like a hand waiting to be held. Maria said it plainly when I went to see her again. A door doesn't have to be built, she told me. It only has to be agreed upon. Consciousness, she explained, was the most fragile boundary we had, always shifting, always open a little. If enough minds rested against the same idea, the same image, the same longing, that boundary thinned until it behaved like an opening. I began to understand the efficiency of it. No blood, no stones, no risk of interruption, just attention, gathered and sustained. People weren't being taken. They were leaning forward together, sharing the weight of the threshold. The danger wasn't possession. It was consent, so diffuse, no one recognized it as choice. And once enough of us stood at that invisible edge, the distinction between inside and outside no longer mattered at all. The first real resistance didn't look like defiance. There were no barricades, no shouted warnings, no sudden clarity. It came quietly, in moments when people simply stopped leaning forward, when a question went unanswered, when a dream was interrupted on purpose. I began telling those most affected to do something simple before sleep. Name objects in the room, recall mundane details, anchor themselves to weight and texture, not prayers, not mantras. Refusal had to be ordinary to work, attention withdrawn, without drama. At first, nothing seemed to change. Then the dreams began to fray at the edges, their continuity breaking, their shared imagery losing coherence. Some people resisted instinctively. They woke themselves when the hum grew too familiar. They turned on lights, grounded their feet, focused on discomfort instead of wonder. These weren't strong minds or trained ones, just people unwilling, for reasons they couldn't articulate, to give themselves over completely. Maria explained it later in a way that stayed with me. They can't take what isn't offered, she said, and they can't force what doesn't move toward them. The watchers weren't blocked by walls or weapons. They were slowed by hesitation, by disinterest, by the refusal to finish a thought someone else had started. I felt it myself during one long night near the station. The pull was there, subtle, familiar, but I stayed seated, named the sounds around me, focused on the ache in my knees, the grit in my mouth. The pressure eased, not angry, not disappointed, just patient. Resistance wasn't victory, it was delay, a holding action built from absence rather than force, and for the first time. I understood that doing nothing, truly nothing, could be an act powerful enough to matter. The decision wasn't made in a meeting. There was no vote, no formal order passed across a desk. Silence settled the way dust does, gradually. Then, all at once, files stopped moving upward. Calls from outside agencies were returned with careful vagueness. Language softened. Words like phenomenon, anomaly, unconfirmed became tools, not truths. I learned how to write reports that satisfied without revealing, how to close cases without endings, how to describe events in ways that left no hooks for curiosity to catch on. It wasn't deception in the way people imagine it. It was containment. The same instinct that keeps you from telling a child exactly what waits in the dark when you're not sure yourself. The town cooperated more easily than I expected. People sensed when not knowing was safer. Conversations shortened. Stories lost detail each time they were retold. Memory blurred where it needed to. What couldn't be erased was dulled through repetition until it felt unimportant, or at least distant. At night, I listened to the radio traffic thin out, the long stretches of nothing growing longer. Silence wasn't absence anymore. It was a buffer, a pressure seal, by refusing to name what we'd encountered. We denied it the shape attention would have given it. I understood then that truth wasn't always a weapon against darkness. Sometimes it was an invitation. And in this case, the most responsible thing I could do wasn't to expose what watched us, but to make sure it had nothing left to listen to. We never said the name out loud at first, not in reports, not over the radio, not even in the quiet after long nights when the temptation to label things grows strongest. Naming felt like a commitment, like drawing a line that something else could trace back to us. But avoidance has its limits. Silence needs structure to hold. The name came from Maria, spoken once, carefully, as if testing whether the air would accept it. Watchers, not hunters, not invaders. Observers with patience measured in generations. The word fit too easily, settling into place without resistance. That alone should have frightened me more than it did. Once named, the work changed. A handful of us began meeting irregularly, never all at once, never in the same place twice. No hierarchy, no oath, just shared understanding. We weren't trying to fight anything. We were learning how to notice without engaging, how to observe our own attention the way we once observed crime scenes. We kept watch over patterns, not lights, over shifts in behavior, not geography. When dreams aligned too closely, we disrupted them. When curiosity spiked, we redirected it. The watchers didn't react the way an enemy would. There was no retaliation, only adjustment, a slow recalibration, like something testing the strength of a barrier without pressing too hard. Naming them didn't give us power, it gave us responsibility, a way to speak precisely without elaboration, a reminder that what watches also learns, and that once you recognize the gaze, the most important discipline is deciding when not to return it. Knowing didn't arrive like revelation. It settled in slowly, the way a chronic ache does, something you learn to move around rather than cure. The fear faded first. Panic requires uncertainty, and I no longer had that luxury. What remained was vigilance, quieter but heavier, a constant awareness of where my attention rested and how long it stayed there. I learned to live inside boundaries that couldn't be marked on maps, to notice when curiosity sharpened into fixation, when wonder began to lean forward instead of standing still. There were nights I felt the pull, subtle, familiar, but it never surprised me anymore. Recognition took the edge off its power. The hardest part was restraint. Not warning people who asked too directly, not explaining when explanations would only create new edges for something else to press against. I watched others carry on with their lives, grateful and unaware, and understood that protection sometimes looks like omission. That mercy can take the shape of ignorance. Sleep returned in fragments. Dreams still came, but they lost their cohesion, their shared grammar. When I woke, the thread that once tugged at my chest felt looser, manageable. I could feel the watch without feeling watched, and that distinction mattered more than I could explain. Living with knowing meant accepting that the world hadn't become stranger. It had always been this way. I had simply learned where not to look too long, when to step back, how to keep my attention from becoming an invitation. Some truths don't ask to be solved. They ask to be carried. And once you accept that weight, you stop searching for an ending and start learning how to stand guard without ever being seen. I returned to the viewing station alone, the way habits circle back to their origin when you stop pretending they're choices. The truck idled softly beside the platform, headlights off, engine heat ticking as it cooled. The desert was calm in a way that felt intentional, the wind restrained, the night holding itself steady. I didn't bring a radio, I didn't bring a notebook. There was nothing left to record that wouldn't change by being written down. I sat on the hood and let the cold seep through the denim, grounding myself in the ache of it. Pain was useful. It kept the edges of thought from blurring. The lights appeared without prompting, familiar now, arranged with a care I'd come to recognize. They held their distance, neither nearer nor farther than they needed to be. I felt no pull this time, no pressure behind the eyes, just presence, mutual, restrained. I took inventory of small things, the weight of my boots, the smell of dust, the steady rhythm of my breathing. I stayed ordinary on purpose. If this was to be a night of endings, I would not make it special. Attention, I'd learned, was the currency they valued most. Time moved strangely, or maybe it didn't move at all. The sky shifted by degrees I couldn't measure. I stayed where I was, neither leaning forward nor turning away, content to remain a fixed point in a landscape that had always preferred patience. Whatever watched from the other side knew I was there, and for the first time. That knowledge didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a courtesy, one last night spent acknowledging the distance that had been so carefully maintained. It happened without warning, in the quiet interval between one breath and the next. The lights shifted, not closer, not brighter, but into a configuration I had never seen before. Their spacing tightened, then aligned, forming a brief, deliberate pattern that held just long enough to be recognized before it began to dissolve. The sensation wasn't awe. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The same feeling you get when someone meets your eyes in a crowd and looks away first. Not out of submission, but acknowledgement. The shape wasn't symbolic in any human sense, yet it carried intent with unmistakable clarity. This was not a signal meant to open anything. It was a response. I felt the pressure behind my eyes return for an instant, softer than before, tempered. No pull followed it, no invitation, just the awareness of being included in a final exchange. I understood then that whatever lay beyond the lights did not experience endings the way we do. What felt like closure to me was simply a pause in their attention. The pattern unraveled slowly, threads of light separating and resuming their familiar distance. The desert exhaled. The hum I'd grown used to faded until it blended back into the wind. I realized my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the strain of remaining still through something that wanted to be noticed. I didn't salute back. I didn't move at all. Some gestures, I knew now, only mattered if they were not returned. And in that restraint, I felt the fragile balance hold. One last acknowledgement exchanged, the glass unbroken, the distance preserved exactly as it needed to be. Morning came without ceremony. The sky lightened, the stars thinned, and the desert resumed its familiar indifference. By the time the sun cleared the hills, the lights were gone, not extinguished, not defeated, simply elsewhere, or perhaps nowhere I was meant to notice. I stayed until the cold lifted, until the ache in my joints reminded me that my body still obeyed ordinary rules. When I finally stood, there was no sense of departure, no threshold crossed. The ground beneath my boots felt unchanged, solid, uninterested in what had nearly happened above it. The door hadn't closed. I understood that with a certainty that no longer frightened me. Doors like that don't shut. They remain, defined not by hinges or frames, but by attention, by the collective agreement to approach or to turn away. What we had built wasn't a barrier. It was a habit of refusal, renewed quietly each day. Driving back toward town, the radio stayed silent. No static, no murmurs, just empty channels doing what they were meant to do. I took that as a good sign, though I knew better than to mistake quiet for absence. Somewhere beyond the desert, something vast continued to watch, patient as ever. And here, on this side of the glass, we continued our lives, unaware by necessity, protected by restraint. The distance held, not because it was enforced, but because it was respected. The door remains, and as long as it does, someone must remember not to lean against it.